All right, we are in week 1, lesson 2. This is the mind-body immune connection. So welcome to lesson 2. Today we're going to explore how trauma is not just an emotional response, but also a physiological and biological alteration. It directly affects your health, particularly if you're dealing with chronic or autoimmune conditions. For decades, Western medicine has separated the body and the mind, which is completely ludicrous, but we're going to talk more about that later. However, research is now showing that trauma fundamentally alters how your nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system function. So when unresolved trauma goes unrecognized, it can keep your body in a prolonged survival state, contributing to fatigue, inflammation, and autoimmunity. So in this lesson, this is to help you understand that your symptoms are not just random, idiopathic, or just in your head. They are actually your body's natural response to what you have lived through. Trauma is not just what happened to you, but rather how it changed what is inside of you. Okay, so trauma is a deeply impactful response to an overwhelming experience or experiences. It is what happens inside your brain and body when you've encountered events that felt life-threatening or deeply distressing, and your system went into survival mode. This response can continue to show up even long after the actual danger has passed, affecting your thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations. So trauma really rewires the nervous system and the way that our brain communicates with other parts of the body. It essentially puts your nervous system on high alert, like a smoke detector that has become extremely sensitive. When you are in a traumatic situation, your body's built-in alarm system, which is your sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, right, kicks into overdrive. And after the trauma, this system can get kind of stuck in that heightened state, making you react strongly to things that aren't actually dangerous because your body is still braced for that threat. It also changes how different parts of your brain talk to each other, almost like in a traffic jam. The part of your brain responsible for fear, which is the amygdala, becomes more active and sends out a whole lot of alarm signals. While at the same time, the part of your brain that helps you think clearly and make decisions and regulate your emotions, which is all kind of here in the prefrontal cortex, can become a lot less active. And this makes it significantly harder to calm down, to focus, to feel like you're in control because your brain is prioritizing survival over everything else, right? That's its job, is to keep you alive. But due to these changes, trauma can deeply reshape how you see yourself and others and the world. And you might find it harder to trust. You struggle feeling safe in relationships or even just in everyday situations, and kind of feel like a different person than you were before. These shifts in your perception and behavior are your system's way of trying to protect you from future harm, even though it is actually working against you in a lot of ways and making things feel harder. So long story short, your brain and your nervous system are kind of doing what they're supposed to, but they're becoming overreactive due to prolonged stress. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of trauma. The first is acute trauma, and this refers to emotional, physiological, and psychological response to a single overwhelming or threatening event that disrupts a person's sense of safety or control. And this certainly activates the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response. It can lead to symptoms such as hypervigilance, intrusive memories, and even avoidance of certain situations, smells, anything that can remind you of that event. This can include examples, car accidents, physical or sexual assault, natural disasters, witnessing a violent act, a medical emergency, anything like that. And if that trauma is not processed, it can become acute stress disorder. And that can potentially evolve into post-traumatic stress disorder if the symptoms persist for more than a month. So totally normal, you would have some dysregulation, right? But if this goes on for more than a month, that's typically where we move more into like the PTSD symptoms. So then the second type is chronic trauma, and chronic trauma is a result of repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful or threatening experiences over a period of time. And this really overwhelms the body's adaptive stress mechanisms and leads to persistent dysregulation. So with PTSD, we're seeing a lot of cortisol imbalance, and of course, that takes a toll on the immune system. There's also long-term HPA axis dysregulation, which don't worry if you don't know what I'm talking about there. We'll discuss that more. But these dysregulations lead to chronic anxiety, dissociation, depression, somatic symptoms, and it really causes our nervous system to just be primed for a threat all the time. So it's really working overtime in this sympathetic overdrive. Some examples of chronic trauma can be ongoing domestic violence or emotional abuse, living in a war zone or refugee situation, long-term childhood bullying or neglect. If you grew up with a lot of financial instability, such as persistent poverty or food insecurity or homelessness, can also be from caregiving. If you've got a lot of caregiving you have to do in high stress environments, caring for a spouse or a child or a parent, that burnout can also be chronic trauma. And chronic trauma is a major risk factor for obviously autoimmune diseases, but also fibromyalgia, IBS, and cardiovascular issues. And it often flies under the radar and is not diagnosed well because it's kind of hard to detect sometimes, right? So the third type of trauma we're going to talk about is complex trauma, and this is sometimes referred to as developmental trauma, and it arises from exposure to multiple or prolonged interpersonal traumatic events, especially during early development, so early on in our childhoods. It deeply disrupts our ability to have healthy attachments and a healthy sense of identity, which totally dysregulates our ability to regulate our emotions well too. So this really alters the brain development in areas like the amygdala, your fight or flight, right? Hippocampus, that's where our memories are kind of stored. And then of course the prefrontal cortex, where we kind of orient with the now and problem solve. This causes emotional dysregulation, dissociation, emotional numbing, sometimes even identity fragmentation. And we tend to get stuck in that fight or flight circle, or sometimes there's a freeze or collapse that happens there too. So some examples of that could be childhood trauma as far as physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, persistent emotional neglect or abandonment, growing up with a caregiver who was struggling with addiction or mental illness or just emotionally unavailable, and repeated ruptures in a sense of safety, trust, and attachment during our early life. Unlike acute trauma, complex trauma doesn't really have a clear beginning or end. It is woven into the developmental experiences, and it often contributes to complex PTSD, or what we call CPTSD, which plays a big role in mood disorders, relational difficulties, and unexplained somatic illnesses. It is also highly correlated with immune disease and chronic fatigue, especially in women. I know these lessons are a little longer, but bear with me. Our first week is pretty intense, and then things get a little light. Okay, so here's why this is so important to our work with autoimmune disease. Typically, when we talk about trauma, it is associated only with mental health. Things like anxiety, depression, emotional dysregulation, angry outbursts, all of this is recognized as symptoms of PTSD. But research increasingly shows that trauma also impacts our physical health just as deeply, and sometimes even more impactfully. Unresolved trauma, especially when it's chronic or complex, can lead to long-term changes in the nervous system, hormone regulation, and immune function. In fact, most people who live with autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue, or unexplained pain are experiencing biological consequences of trauma, even if they don't recognize that connection. And this matters because if we only treat the physical symptoms like inflammation, pain, digestive issues, but we're not understanding their root causes, we risk missing the full picture, right? And a misdiagnosis. By recognizing that many physical symptoms are actually rooted in the body's trauma response, we can move toward more compassionate, holistic, and effective healing. This shift in understanding is not just powerful, but it is imperative to our healing process. So, to keep building on our understanding of how trauma affects our health, let's look at an overview of how it changes our biology. First, mind-body immune interaction basically is stating that trauma doesn't just stay in your head. It changes how your brain, hormones, and immune system communicate. So when these systems get out of balance, the body has a harder time staying healthy and bouncing back from stress. And this is why people with trauma histories often feel physically unwell and fatigued or inflamed, even when there's no clear medical cause. So the second impact is chronic inflammation pathways, and this is a really big one for autoimmune disorders. When trauma is ongoing or unhealed, it creates a kind of internal alarm system that never really shuts off. And this triggers the release of inflammatory chemicals, which are called cytokines, and they spread throughout the body. So over time, this low-level inflammation contributes to the development of chronic diseases like autoimmune conditions, heart disease, or IBS. So third, there is a big impact on the neuroimmune connectivity. So your brain and immune system are in constant communication. And when the amygdala, which is kind of where the brain's fear center is located, is always on high alert, it is sending stress signals that change how your immune system behaves. And this can make inflammation worse and slow down healing, even long after the original trauma is over. So the big takeaway is this: trauma does not just affect how you feel emotionally. It changes how your body functions at a cellular level. And understanding that is absolutely imperative to your healing journey. Okay, so now we're going to take a closer look at how trauma impacts the most vital organ in your body, the brain. Trauma changes the brain. It activates the amygdala, which is your brain's alarm center, and it dampens the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making, empathy, and just kind of calming you down. It also affects the hippocampus, which helps you distinguish between past and present. And that's why trauma survivors can feel like a past experience is happening again right then in that moment, even if, logically they are safe. So over time, your brain becomes wired for protection instead of connection. And this hypervigilant state keeps your body in survival mode and contributes to nervous system exhaustion, inflammation, and immune dysfunction. Now, we mentioned the HPA axis earlier, so a little more background on that. It's short for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It is your body's command center for managing stress. So when you experience a threat, the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which then signals the adrenal glands to release cortisol, the main stress hormone. Now, this system is built to help you survive short bursts of danger. But when we're talking about chronic trauma, it stays switched on, meaning your cortisol levels spike or crash erratically, and your immune system becomes very dysregulated. This leads to cytokine imbalance and gut permeability, and over time, conditions like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and chronic fatigue. So when the HPA axis is overactivated for too long, your body begins to lose the ability to distinguish between real threats and false alarms, and that confusion can turn inward as autoimmunity. Okay, so now let's zoom in even more and look at how all this dysregulation in the brain functioning directly impacts our immune system. So the immune system is not just a defense system. It is deeply influenced by your emotional state. So when things like chronic trauma dysregulate the HPA axis and the nervous system, it throws the immune system into overdrive. And you may develop chronic inflammation, increased white blood cell activity, or autoantibodies that begin to attack your own tissues. And studies have shown that people with PTSD, childhood trauma, or chronic stress have much higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines and immune confusion, which basically means your symptoms are not imagined. They are biological echoes of emotional wounds that have not been fully addressed. So one of the most important studies in this area is the ACE study, and ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this research found a dose-response relationship between early life trauma and adult chronic illness. So in other words, the more ACEs that you have, the more likely you are to develop health problems later. And people with 4 or more ACEs were over twice as likely to be diagnosed with autoimmune conditions like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. Additional studies have shown that trauma survivors have elevated inflammation and stress hormone imbalances years or even decades after the trauma occurred, which doesn't make it hard to connect the dots between trauma equals inflammation equals autoimmunity. And understanding this allows us to reframe autoimmune disease as not something wrong with you, but as your body's natural attempt to be proactive in protecting you from future overwhelming experiences. It's how you survived. The problem is it's overactive and it's obviously causing more problems than it's helping at this point. So we have to reteach our bodies that the danger that was once perceived, right? The danger it's trying to protect us from is not actually present in the here and now. It was before. It is not now. So one of the most painful realities for people with chronic illness is not just the symptoms, it's feeling dismissed or misunderstood. I'm sure a lot of you can probably relate to that. In most traditional medical settings, trauma is not screened for. Your lab work might be checked, your medications adjusted, but no one really asks you about your emotional history or what your body has lived through. And this disconnection between physical and emotional health can lead to misdiagnoses, ineffective treatment, and feelings of shame and self-doubt. You are not too sensitive. It is not all in your head. Your body is responding exactly as it was designed to, based on these past experiences. So Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote The Body Keeps the Score, which if you haven't read this book, I cannot recommend it enough. It's basically the holy grail of trauma-informed therapy. But he talked about how even if your mind has tried to move on or forget, your body holds the story. Symptoms like pain, tension, fatigue, gut issues, or immune flares may be your body's way of saying, I'm not safe yet. These are not signs of weakness. They are survival strategies your nervous system has developed over time. And the beautiful thing is that just as your body remembers pain, it also remembers how to heal when given the right conditions of safety, support, and connection. And that's what we are looking to build here. Healing from trauma and chronic illness isn't just about medication or symptom management. It's about helping your body recognize that the threat has passed. And this includes nervous system regulation through tools like breath work, grounding, and somatic therapy. It also means creating safe, emotionally nourishing relationships where you feel seen and heard and valued. And it involves processing stored emotional pain so that it no longer drives your biology. And we're going to take a closer look at these tools and techniques over the course of this program. But for now, just want you to remember that healing is not a straight line, but every step towards integration through mind, body, and soul is a step towards your progress. So here are some journal prompts for this week. As always, there's a link to them in week 1, lesson 2, so you can fill this out in that Google document, or like I said, if you want to print it out and handwrite it, that's great too. Again, just please make sure that you're doing these and taking the time to really check in with yourself. Journaling helps bridge awareness from your mind to your body. So these prompts aren't about fixing anything. They're about noticing and listening and offering compassion to the parts of you that may still be holding pain or tension. So let this just be a gentle space to explore what healing might mean for you, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. There are no wrong answers, just your truth. So take that time to check in with yourself. And one more thing, just want to leave you with another quote. This is actually from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, because, like I said, I really admire him and the work that he's done regarding trauma. But he says, trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Really powerful quote. So thank you for allowing this time for yourself and to be here with me. It takes a lot of courage to examine not just what's going on in your body, but also why, and, if you take nothing else away from this today, you are not broken. You are adaptive, intelligent, and deeply resilient. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about some concrete tools and strategies to begin calming your immune system, regulating your nervous system, and restoring safety to your internal world. So your story matters. I'm happy to be a part of this healing journey, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in lesson 3.